For 160 million years, they ruled this planet without question. They filled every corner of the Earth, every ecological niche, every continent, and every ocean. They soared through the skies on vast, leathery wings. They thundered across open plains on legs as thick as tree trunks. They hunted in packs through primordial forests, communicating with one another in ways we are only beginning to understand. The dinosaurs were not simply a chapter in the story of life on Earth. They were the story. For an incomprehensible stretch of geological time, nothing else came close to their dominance. And then, in the blink of an eye by geological standards, they were gone. But the story of how the dinosaurs disappeared is far more complex, far more dramatic, and far more consequential than most people ever realize. It is not simply a tale of a rock falling from the sky and ending everything at once. It is a story of fire and darkness, of starvation and cold, of survival against impossible odds, and ultimately of the extraordinary resilience of life itself. It is a story that explains not only why the dinosaurs vanished, but why you are sitting here reading these words today. Because without that catastrophe 66 million years ago, the mammals that eventually gave rise to human beings might never have had the opportunity to become anything more than small, frightened creatures hiding in burrows beneath the feet of giants. This is the complete account of the day the dinosaurs disappeared forever. What exactly happened, what the planet looked like in the years and decades and centuries that followed, which creatures survived and which did not, and how the world was slowly, painstakingly rebuilt from almost nothing. Prepare yourself. This is one of the greatest stories ever written by the forces of nature. To fully understand what was lost, we have to first understand what existed. In the closing chapters of the Cretaceous period, which stretched from approximately 145 million years ago to 66 million years ago, the Earth was almost unrecognizable compared to the world we inhabit today. The continents were not yet in their modern positions. The Atlantic Ocean was narrower. The inland seas of North America divided the continent into separate land masses. The climate was considerably warmer than today, with no permanent ice caps at the poles and lush tropical vegetation extending far into what we would now consider temperate zones. This was a world of almost incomprehensible biological richness. Towering sauropods moved through dense forests, their footsteps shaking the ground like minor earthquakes. Horned ceratopsians grazed in vast herds across open floodplains. Armored ankylosaurs moved slowly but purposefully through the undergrowth, their bodies encased in bony armor that made them nearly impregnable to attack. And above them all, presiding over this entire world with an authority that no creature has quite matched since, stood the great predators of the late Cretaceous, most famously the Tyrannosaurus rex itself. The late Cretaceous was in many ways the apex of dinosaur evolution. Millions of years of adaptive pressure had produced creatures of extraordinary sophistication. The hadrosaurs, sometimes called duck-billed dinosaurs, possessed dental batteries of hundreds of interlocking teeth, capable of processing the toughest vegetation with remarkable efficiency. Triceratops had evolved not only its iconic trio of horns, but a massive bony frill that may have functioned as a signaling device for social communication and mate selection, flushed with color-changing blood in ways that paleontologists are only beginning to appreciate. Even the fearsome Tyrannosaurus rex, long assumed to be a simple-minded brute, is now understood to have possessed a sophisticated sensory system, keen binocular vision, and potentially a level of social behavior that would have surprised earlier generations of scientists. Pterosaurs still dominated the skies. Quetzalcoatlus, with a wingspan that could reach up to 36 feet, was as large as a small aircraft, and it soared on thermal currents over an inland North America that no longer exists. The oceans teemed with mosasaurs, enormous marine reptiles that had filled the ecological role vacated by earlier ichthyosaurs, alongside long-necked plesiosaurs and the ammonites, those spiral-shelled cephalopods that had been a constant presence in Earth's oceans for hundreds of millions of years. It was a complete, balanced, magnificently functioning world. And 66 million years ago, it ended. The object that ended the age of dinosaurs had been traveling through space for an enormous period of time before it found the Earth. Scientists estimate it was approximately 6 to 9 miles in diameter, roughly the size of a small city, composed of rock and metal and ancient interstellar material that had been drifting through the solar system since the very beginning of our cosmic neighborhood. By the standards of Earth-altering impacts, it was large, but not the largest impactor in our planet's history. What made it so devastatingly effective was where it hit, what that region of the Earth was made of, and the chain of consequences that its arrival set into motion. The asteroid was traveling at roughly 45,000 miles per hour when it entered Earth's atmosphere. At that velocity, it would have crossed the entire depth of the atmosphere in less than a second. There would have been no meaningful warning. Even if any creature on Earth had possessed the cognitive capacity to look up and understand what it was seeing in those final moments, there would have been nothing to be done. The object struck what is today the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, a region that was at the time a shallow tropical sea, sitting atop a geological formation extraordinarily rich in sulfur-bearing minerals. This geological detail, seemingly trivial, would turn out to be one of the most consequential facts in the entire history of life on Earth. The impact released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. In a single instant, the shallow sea and the rock beneath it were vaporized. A crater approximately 110 miles in diameter was gouged into the planet's surface. The force of the impact sent shock waves through the Earth's crust, triggering earthquakes of a magnitude that dwarfs anything in recorded human history. The surrounding ocean was displaced by the impact and sent outward in the form of tsunamis of truly incomprehensible scale. Walls of water hundreds of feet high, racing outward from the impact site at the speed of a commercial jet, flooding coastlines across the entire Gulf of Mexico region and beyond. Within the impact zone itself, nothing survived. The vaporization was total and instantaneous. But the true catastrophe, the mechanism by which the rest of the world's creatures would eventually die, had just begun. In the immediate aftermath of the impact, the material ejected from the crater traveled on ballistic trajectories far out into the upper atmosphere and beyond, some of it actually reaching the edge of space before falling back down. As this debris re-entered the atmosphere, it generated an extraordinary amount of heat through friction. Some models suggest that the thermal radiation produced by this re-entering debris was intense enough to ignite wildfires across enormous areas of the planet, essentially baking the surface of the Earth from above for a period of hours. Imagine the scene across a world that had no warning. Across North America, across Europe, across Asia, forest fires of unprecedented scale erupted, not because lightning had struck or volcanic activity had ignited dry material, but simply because the sky was too hot. Animals that had been going about their ordinary business hours earlier now found themselves in the middle of an inferno with nowhere to run. The larger the animal, the more difficult it was to find shelter, to burrow underground, to find a body of water deep enough to offer protection. Survival in these initial hours was largely a matter of luck and position. Creatures in the right place, perhaps underground, perhaps in deep water, perhaps simply on the far side of a mountain range that absorbed some of the thermal pulse, had a chance. Everything else perished in the flames. The fires produced their own additional catastrophe in the form of soot. Enormous quantities of black carbon were lofted into the upper atmosphere, where it joined the already staggering quantities of dust and vaporized rock that the impact itself had thrown skyward. Together, these materials began to form a global layer of particulate matter that would have consequences stretching across years and decades rather than hours and days. Within weeks of the impact, the sky was effectively dark. Not the comforting darkness of night, which gives way to dawn, but a deep, sustained obscurity in which the sun's energy could not penetrate to the surface in any meaningful quantity. Scientists studying the geological record of this period have found layers of soot and impact debris in rock formations all around the world, and their analysis suggests that the dust concentration in the atmosphere in the first 600 to 700 days after the impact was sufficient to block virtually all direct sunlight from reaching the ground. This was not merely an inconvenience. It was an existential catastrophe for virtually every ecosystem on the planet. Photosynthesis, the process by which plants convert sunlight into energy, essentially stopped. Not everywhere at once, and not immediately, but with terrible swiftness and thoroughness. Without photosynthesis, plants began to die. They did not die overnight, but they began dying, and without new growth replacing what was lost, the total amount of plant matter available on the planet began to shrink at a rate that the planet's ecosystems simply could not accommodate. For the great herbivores, the hadrosaurs and sauropods and ceratopsians that had spent millions of years evolving to consume enormous quantities of vegetation every single day, this was a death sentence being written in very slow but indelible ink. A full-grown Argentinosaurus, one of the largest creatures that ever lived, may have needed to consume close to 1/4 of a ton of vegetation every day simply to maintain its body weight. When the plants begin dying and new growth ceases, an animal of that size has nowhere to turn. There is no fallback option, no alternative food source capable of sustaining something that large. The great herbivores began to starve, and when the herbivores begin to starve, the great predators are not far behind. A Tyrannosaurus rex that cannot find sufficient prey is a Tyrannosaurus rex on a countdown. The entire food chain, that elegant interconnected web of predator and prey that had taken millions of years to develop, began collapsing from the bottom up. The smaller creatures died first because they were less able to store sufficient reserves of energy. The larger creatures died later, but they died nonetheless. The impact site on the Yucatan Peninsula was not merely geologically unfortunate. It was catastrophically, almost unimaginably poorly chosen from the perspective of the planet's living inhabitants. The rock formation beneath the impact zone, known as the Chicxulub structure, contained enormous deposits of sulfur-bearing minerals, specifically anhydrite and gypsum. When these minerals were vaporized by the impact, they released sulfur compounds into the atmosphere on a scale that the planet had rarely, if ever, experienced. Once in the upper atmosphere, these sulfur compounds combined with water vapor to form sulfate aerosols, tiny droplets of sulfuric acid suspended in the stratosphere. Unlike the soot and dust that eventually settled out of the atmosphere over months and years, the sulfate aerosols were more persistent, and they had a specific and devastating effect on the Earth's climate. They functioned as a thermal blanket in reverse, a barrier that prevented the sun's energy from warming the planet's surface, while simultaneously trapping very little of the heat already present. The result was global cooling on a dramatic scale. Average temperatures across much of the planet dropped by as much as 15 to 20 degrees Celsius in some regions, a change comparable to the difference between a comfortable spring day and a brutal polar winter. The precise timing and severity of this cooling varied enormously by location, but the global effect was clear and devastating. Ecosystems that had evolved over millions of years to function within a specific temperature range were suddenly exposed to conditions far outside anything they had encountered before. For the reptiles, cold-blooded animals whose metabolism is directly dependent on ambient temperature, this cooling was particularly lethal. Even those dinosaurs that had survived the initial impact and its immediate consequences, that had found food and water and shelter, now faced a climate that their physiology was simply not designed to tolerate. It is worth noting that modern research suggests at least some dinosaurs, particularly the small feathered theropods that were ancestral to modern birds, may have had a degree of warm-bloodedness. But the large dinosaurs, the giants that defined the Cretaceous world, were almost certainly not capable of maintaining their body temperature independently of their environment. As the cold deepened, so did their vulnerability. The sulfur compounds in the atmosphere had another consequence beyond global cooling. As they combined with water and fell back to Earth as precipitation, the rain that reached the ground was highly acidic, far more acidic than the so-called acid rain produced by modern industrial pollution. This acid rain had the potential to directly damage plant tissue, further accelerating the collapse of vegetation that was already underway due to the loss of sunlight. It also had serious effects on freshwater ecosystems, raising the acidity of rivers and lakes to levels that many aquatic species could not survive. The oceans were similarly affected. The massive injection of carbon dioxide from the impact itself and from the wildfires, combined with the dissolution of sulfate compounds into seawater, began driving a rapid acidification of the world's oceans. Marine ecosystems that had seemed robust and diverse just months before, the impact now found themselves in a chemical environment that was becoming hostile to many of the species that form the foundation of the food chain. The calcareous plankton, tiny organisms that build their shells from calcium carbonate, were particularly vulnerable to ocean acidification. These organisms form the base of the marine food chain in much the same way that plants form the base of the terrestrial food chain. When their populations collapsed, everything that depended on them, the small fish, the larger fish, and ultimately the great marine reptiles at the top, faced the same cascading catastrophe that was unfolding on land. The ammonites, those spectacularly successful spiral-shelled cephalopods that had survived previous mass extinctions and had been a constant presence in the world's oceans for over 300 million years, finally met their match. The combination of ocean acidification, the collapse of their food supply, and the general destabilization of the marine ecosystem proved too much even for these remarkably resilient animals. The ammonites, so numerous and so diverse that their fossils are found in rock formations on every continent, disappeared almost completely at the Cretaceous boundary. Not everything died. This point cannot be emphasized strongly enough. The Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event, devastating as it was not a complete sterilization of the planet. Life, as it has always done, found a way. But the question of which creatures survived and which did not tells us something profound about the nature of survival itself, about the role of body size, dietary flexibility, and sheer geological luck in determining which lineages would inherit the post-impact world. The most immediate factor in survival was size. Almost universally, large animals fared worse than small ones. The reason for this is straightforward and merciless. Larger animals require more food. In a world where food is rapidly disappearing, an animal that requires very little to survive has an enormous advantage over one that requires a great deal. The threshold appears to have been somewhere in the vicinity of 50 to 60 pounds. Animals above this weight, as a very general rule, struggled enormously to find sufficient nutrition in the post-impact environment. Animals below it had at least a fighting chance. This is why, despite the enormous diversity of the Cretaceous world, the creatures that came through the extinction event most successfully were almost uniformly small. The small mammals that had spent the entire Mesozoic era living in the shadows of the dinosaurs, hiding in burrows by day and foraging cautiously at night, suddenly found themselves in a world where their greatest competitive disadvantages had been turned into advantages. Their small bodies required little food. Their burrowing lifestyle meant they were somewhat insulated from the worst of the temperature swings. Their omnivorous diet, capable of processing whatever organic material was available, whether seeds, insects, fungi, or the carrion of larger animals, gave them options that the specialist feeders did not have. The ability to eat almost anything was arguably the single most important trait a creature could possess in the immediate aftermath of the impact. Specialists, animals that had evolved to exploit a particular food source very efficiently, found themselves trapped when that food source disappeared. Generalists, animals capable of switching between different food types as circumstances demanded, could adapt. This is why the toothed birds, those avian dinosaurs that had specialized in hunting insects and small animals, largely disappeared, while the beaked birds, capable of harvesting seeds and nuts that persisted in the soil long after the living plants had died, managed to survive in significant numbers. The story of the beaked birds is one of the most remarkable in all of evolutionary history. By the late Cretaceous, birds had already diversified enormously from their theropod ancestors. There were birds with teeth, birds with long bony tails, birds specialized for diving, for soaring, for hunting, for fishing. Most of these lineages were lost in the extinction event, but the birds with beaks, the ones whose anatomy allowed them to crack open seeds and process dry plant material that other animals could not efficiently utilize, had a survival advantage that proved decisive. From these survivors, all modern birds are descended. Every sparrow, every eagle, every ostrich, every penguin owes its existence to the dietary flexibility of a small beaked bird that got through the worst years after the impact by eating seeds from the soil. In the oceans, the survivors were similarly characterized by their ability to exploit whatever resources remained available. The sharks, those ancient and remarkably conservative animals whose basic body plan had changed relatively little since the Devonian period, came through the extinction with their populations reduced but intact. Their relatively modest nutritional requirements and their ability to consume almost any organic material available, including carrion, gave them resilience that the great mosasaurs and plesiosaurs lacked entirely. The ray-finned fish, already diverse and numerous, were similarly resilient, and in the absence of the ammonites that had previously competed with them for plankton, they found the post-extinction oceans suddenly much more accommodating. Among the land animals, the small insectivorous and omnivorous mammals, the tiny ancestors of every warm-blooded creature alive today, came through the worst of the extinction and into the other side. So did the ancestors of modern crocodilians, whose ability to survive for extended periods without food by lowering their metabolic rate proved extraordinarily valuable. Various species of lizard and turtle and frog and salamander persisted. The world after the extinction was not empty. It was diminished, yes, and radically altered, but it was not a sterile wasteland. It was a world waiting for something to fill it. There is a question that haunts paleontologists and dinosaur enthusiasts alike. When exactly did the last non-avian dinosaur die? The honest answer is that we do not know, and we may never know with precision. The fossil record, extraordinary as it is, cannot capture individual deaths or even individual species' final moments with the kind of resolution that would allow us to say with confidence that on a particular day or even a particular decade, the last ceratopsian or the last hadrosaur drew its final breath. What we do know is that the geological record shows a clear and dramatic reduction in dinosaur diversity at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, the thin but globally distributed layer of iridium-rich clay that marks the moment of impact. Above that boundary in the rock record, non-avian dinosaur fossils essentially cease. This does not mean they all died on the same day. It means that within the resolution of the geological record, which compresses thousands of years into millimeters of sediment, they disappear. The best current evidence suggests that the non-avian dinosaurs were extinct within somewhere between a few thousand and a few 100,000 years of the impact. In geological terms, this is almost instantaneous. In human terms, it is an incomprehensibly long period of time. It is entirely possible that small populations of dinosaurs persisted in isolated refugia, corners of the planet where local conditions allowed survival long after their relatives elsewhere had perished. Perhaps a small population of hadrosaurs found a valley with sufficient plant life. Perhaps a surviving theropod managed to sustain itself on carrion and whatever small animals it could find. But these would have been the final embers of an enormous fire, gradually going cold. There is something profoundly moving about imagining these last survivors. A solitary triceratops, aging and thin, wandering through a landscape of dead trees and ash. The last Tyrannosaurus rex, once the apex of 65 million years of evolutionary refinement, reduced to scavenging whatever organic matter could be found in a world where the great herds no longer existed. There is no drama in these final deaths, no last stand, no confrontation, just the slow, quiet extinction of something magnificent. The planet that emerged from the extinction event was a profoundly changed place. For the first several 100,000 years after the impact, it was characterized more by absence than by presence. The great forests were gone, replaced in many areas by vast stretches of fern, which were among the first plants capable of recolonizing disturbed ground. Paleobotanists studying rock formations from this period find what they call the fern spike. an extraordinary proliferation of fern spores in the immediate post-impact layers that reflects the temporary dominance of ferns over the devastated landscape. These fern fields were not, of course, the magnificent ecosystems of the Cretaceous. They were pioneer communities, the first cautious reclamation of bare ground by plant life. But they represented something critically important. They represented food. Where there are plants, there can be herbivores. And where there are herbivores, the rest of the food chain can begin to rebuild. The small mammals that had survived the worst of the extinction began to explore this new world. Without the dinosaurs that had kept them small and cautious and nocturnal for over 150 million years, these creatures faced a set of ecological opportunities that their lineage had never before encountered. The large body niches, the roles of large herbivore and large predator that had been filled by dinosaurs, were now vacant, and evolution, given the opportunity and the time, is extraordinarily good at filling vacant niches. The first mammals to begin growing larger were not immediately recognizable as the ancestors of the creatures we know today. The earliest Paleocene mammals were often strange, experimental-looking creatures, the evolutionary equivalent of rough drafts, as natural selection worked through the possibilities available in a newly opened ecological landscape. Some were large and bulky, but belonged to lineages that would eventually die out without leaving modern descendants. Others were smaller and less immediately impressive, but carried in their genetics the blueprints for everything that would follow. It took time. This point deserves emphasis, because the popular imagination sometimes compresses the post-extinction recovery into something much faster than it actually was. The planet's ecosystems did not snap back to a state of rich complexity within a few decades of the impact. The recovery was measured in millions of years. The first 10 to 15 million years of the Paleocene epoch were a period of relatively modest biological diversity compared to what had existed before and what would eventually exist again. Large, complex ecosystems require time to develop. The species that fill them need time to evolve. The relationships between predators and prey, between plants and pollinators, between different trophic levels of the food chain, need time to establish themselves. But gradually, painstakingly, life rebuilt itself. And the world that emerged from this rebuilding process was one that, for the first time in 160 million years, was fundamentally shaped not by the dinosaurs but by the mammals. The diversification of mammals in the wake of the extinction event is one of the most dramatic examples of adaptive radiation in the entire fossil record. Within a relatively short geological time frame following the impact, mammals had diversified into an enormous variety of forms, filling ecological niches that had been occupied by dinosaurs for millions of years. The process was not orderly or linear. It was messy and experimental and filled with evolutionary dead ends. Many of the early post-extinction mammals belong to lineages that are now entirely extinct, that left no descendants and represent evolutionary experiments that the changing conditions of the Paleocene and Eocene eventually rendered obsolete. But among this diverse and sometimes bizarre array of early mammals were the ancestors of every warm-blooded creature alive today, every bat and whale and horse and primate and elephant. One of the most remarkable transformations of the post-extinction period was the return of mammals to the sea. The mosasaurs and plesiosaurs that had dominated the Cretaceous oceans were gone, and the oceans offered an extraordinary abundance of food for any creature capable of exploiting them. Over millions of years, certain land-dwelling mammals began making tentative forays into aquatic environments, gradually evolving the anatomical changes necessary for efficient swimming and eventually for fully aquatic life. The creature known as Ambulocetus, whose name translates roughly as the walking whale, represents one of the most extraordinary evolutionary snapshots in the fossil record. Living approximately 48 million years ago, Ambulocetus was a mammal that still had functional legs and could move on land, but whose anatomy already showed clear adaptations for aquatic life. It represents one moment in an evolutionary journey that eventually produced the whales, dolphins, and other cetaceans that fill the world's oceans today. These animals did not simply stumble into the oceans. They were driven there by a combination of ecological opportunity and competitive pressure. The oceans offered food in enormous abundance, and the mammals that could exploit that food had no serious competition because the great marine reptiles were gone. This is the pattern that repeats again and again in the post-extinction world. Vacant niches, pulling creatures toward new lifestyles and new anatomical configurations, driven by the irresistible logic of natural selection. On land, the diversification was equally spectacular. The ungulates, the hoofed mammals that would eventually give rise to horses, cattle, deer, elephants, and dozens of other lineages, began their explosive diversification in the early Paleocene. The carnivorous mammals developed alongside them, initially represented by large, rather clumsy predators from lineages that have since vanished, but eventually giving rise to the cats, dogs, bears, and other meat-eating mammals that characterize modern ecosystems. The primates themselves, the lineage that would eventually produce the great apes and ultimately human beings, were among the earliest mammalian orders to diversify in the post-extinction world. The earliest primates were small, tree-dwelling animals, perhaps somewhat resembling modern tarsiers or lemurs, exploiting the forested environments that were gradually returning to the warmer regions of the planet. The development of primate characteristics, grasping hands, forward-facing eyes, providing binocular vision, and unusually large brains relative to body size, represented adaptations to a life in the trees that would, tens of millions of years later, prove extraordinarily useful on the ground as well. The story of the post-extinction recovery cannot be told without discussing the extraordinary rise of the flowering plants. The angiosperms, as botanists call them, had already begun diversifying before the extinction event, but the Cretaceous world was still largely dominated by the gymnosperms, the conifers and cycads and other seed plants that had been the dominant vegetation for much of the Mesozoic era. The extinction event affected the plant world heavily, but not uniformly. Species that depended on specific pollinator relationships, intricate ecological partnerships built up over millions of years, were devastated when their partners disappeared. But the flowering plants, with their remarkable reproductive flexibility and their capacity for rapid adaptation, proved extraordinarily resilient. Their seeds could persist in the soil through difficult conditions. Their capacity for double fertilization gave their seeds a nutritional advantage over the seeds of gymnosperms, and their sheer evolutionary flexibility allowed them to colonize the disturbed and recovering landscapes of the post-extinction world with remarkable speed. As the climate stabilized and temperatures began to recover, flowering plants swept across the landscape in an explosion of diversity that transformed the visual and ecological character of the world's terrestrial environments. The monochrome green of gymnosperm-dominated forests gave way to an increasingly colorful and varied world of flowers, fruits, and an almost bewildering diversity of leaf shapes and plant forms. For the mammals attempting to fill the ecological niches left vacant by the dinosaurs, this explosion of flowering plant diversity was an enormous gift. Fruits provided highly nutritious food, flowers provided nectar and pollen, seeds provided dense concentrations of energy, and the sheer variety of plant forms provided an equally varied set of ecological opportunities for the animals that could exploit them. The interaction between the flowering plants and the animals of the post-extinction world became one of the defining dynamics of the Cenozoic era. Mammals became pollinators. They became seed dispersers, carrying fruits in their digestive systems and depositing seeds in new locations as they moved across the landscape. Some mammals became so intimately tied to specific plant species that their evolutionary histories became effectively intertwined, each driving changes in the other through the relentless feedback loops of coevolution. This partnership between flowering plants and mammals, still ongoing and still extraordinarily productive, is visible everywhere in the modern world. Every apple orchard and every wheat field, every tropical rainforest canopy and every temperate deciduous woodland represents the outcome of 66 million years of co-evolutionary relationship between plants that learn to appeal to animals and animals that learn to exploit plants. And it all began in the aftermath of the event that killed the dinosaurs. While mammals were filling the terrestrial niches left vacant by the non-avian dinosaurs and beginning their slow march toward the ecological dominance they hold today, the skies above belonged to the birds. The avian dinosaurs that had survived the extinction, the beaked, feathered descendants of the small theropods of the Mesozoic era, found themselves in a world where the great pterosaurs that had shared and often dominated the aerial environment were entirely gone. The diversification of birds in the post-extinction world is a story that rivals the mammalian radiation in its scope and speed. Within the first 10 to 15 million years of the Paleocene, birds had already begun diversifying into many of the major groups recognizable today: waterbirds, shorebirds, raptors, and the ancestors of the perching birds that make up more than half of all living bird species were all establishing themselves in their respective ecological niches. But the post-extinction bird world was not merely the familiar bird world of today in miniature. It was also a world of extraordinary avian experiments, some of which have no parallel in the modern world. Without large terrestrial mammals in the earliest post-extinction years, some birds evolved to fill the large predator niche on land. The forest wrasses, commonly known as terror birds, were flightless predatory birds that reached up to 10 feet in height and possessed beaks capable of delivering devastating blows to prey. For millions of years in South America, which was geographically isolated from the other continents, these creatures were the apex terrestrial predators, filling a role that on other continents was eventually taken over by the large carnivorous mammals. The evolution of flightlessness itself is a recurring theme in the post-extinction bird world. Freed from the need to escape aerial predators, and in some cases freed from terrestrial predators as well, by geographic isolation, various bird lineages independently lost the ability to fly and evolved large, robust bodies better suited to terrestrial life. The ratites, the group that includes ostriches, emus, rheas, cassowaries, and kiwis, represent the surviving members of this tendency, and their global distribution tells the story of how the breakup of the ancient supercontinents carried bird populations to different parts of the world before flightlessness made dispersal across open water impossible. The birds of today, all 10,000 or so recognized species, represent the sole surviving lineage of the dinosaurs. When you watch a sparrow crack open a sunflower seed, you are watching a dinosaur doing what dinosaurs do. When an eagle spreads its wings over a mountain valley, you are watching the direct descendant of creatures that roamed the earth for 160 million years. The dinosaurs did not entirely disappear, they merely changed. The oceans that emerged from the extinction event were transformed places, scarred by acidification and the collapse of many of the complex food webs that had characterized the Cretaceous seas. But life in the ocean is, if anything, even more resilient than life on land, and the recovery of marine ecosystems, while slow and painful, produced a world of extraordinary diversity. The ray-finned fish, already numerous before the extinction, found themselves in a post-extinction ocean that was in many ways designed for their success. The ammonites, which had competed intensively with fish for planktonic food resources, were gone. The great marine reptiles, which had preyed on fish with devastating efficiency, were gone. The ocean was, in a sense, waiting for the fish to fill it, and fill it they did, in an adaptive radiation that produced the overwhelming diversity of teleos fish that dominates the modern ocean. Today, ray-finned fish represent more than 95% of all fish species, and fish as a whole represent the majority of vertebrate species on the planet. This extraordinary dominance has its roots in the post-extinction recovery of the world's oceans. The sharks survived but did not come to dominate in the way they might have if the ray-finned fish had not proven so spectacularly successful. The marine mammals that began entering the ocean in the Eocene would eventually evolve into the whales and dolphins that today rival the largest creatures in Earth's history in size, but they arrived on a scene that the fish had already claimed. The coral reefs, those extraordinarily complex and productive marine ecosystems that had existed in various forms since the Paleozoic era, experienced a severe collapse in the aftermath of the extinction. The combination of ocean acidification, temperature disruption, and the loss of many of the species that had built and maintained reef communities meant that the reef ecosystems of the Paleocene were shadows of their Cretaceous predecessors. The recovery of coral reef systems took millions of years and produced communities that, while superficially similar to modern reefs, were composed of quite different species assemblages. The plankton, those microscopic organisms that form the absolute foundation of the marine food web, recovered relatively quickly by geological standards. Within a few million years of the extinction, the plankton communities of the world's oceans had rebuilt themselves to something approaching their former diversity. This recovery of the base of the food chain was what made possible the subsequent recovery of everything above it, from the small invertebrates to the fish to the marine mammals. It is a reminder that in ecosystems, as in so much else, everything depends on foundations. The story of the extinction and its aftermath is not merely theoretical. It is written in extraordinary detail in the rock record, and the scientists who study that record have developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for reading it. The boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene, That catastrophic moment 66 million years ago is marked in rock formations around the world by a thin layer of clay enriched in the element iridium. Iridium is rare in Earth's surface rocks, but common in asteroids and other extraterrestrial objects. Its global distribution in this thin clay layer was one of the critical pieces of evidence that led scientists in the early 1980s, particularly the team of Luis and Walter Alvarez, to propose that the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous was caused by an asteroid impact. At the time, this proposal was controversial and strongly disputed. Today, it is the scientific consensus, supported by an overwhelming body of evidence from geology, geochemistry, paleontology, and the discovery of the Chicxulub crater itself, buried beneath the seafloor and the Yucatan Peninsula. The fossil record on either side of this boundary is stark in its contrast. Below the boundary, in the Cretaceous rock, the diversity and abundance of large organisms is extraordinary. Dinosaur fossils, ammonite shells, mosasaur remains, the traces of a world teeming with large and complex life. Above the boundary, in the immediately post-impact layers, these organisms disappear. The contrast is not gradual, it is abrupt. One layer of rock contains the evidence of a living world. The layer immediately above it contains almost none. This abruptness is itself one of the most important things the fossil record tells us about the extinction. The alternative hypothesis that the dinosaurs declined gradually over millions of years before the impact, driven by climate change or volcanic activity or competition with mammals, is not supported by the evidence from most fossil sites. The non-avian dinosaurs were, by all indications, a diverse and flourishing group right up to the moment of impact. This makes their disappearance all the more striking and all the more sobering. The Deccan Traps, an enormous volcanic province in what is today India, was also active during the latest Cretaceous, and some scientists have argued that the massive volcanic eruptions of this period contributed to the environmental stress that made the extinction so severe. The debate about the relative contribution of the Chicxulub impact versus the Deccan volcanism is ongoing in the scientific literature, and the honest answer is probably that both played roles, with the impact providing the catastrophic initial blow and the volcanic activity potentially prolonging or deepening the subsequent environmental disruption. The extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs is not simply a historical curiosity, a fascinating chapter in the deep past with no relevance to the present. It carries lessons that resonate with uncomfortable force in a world where human activity is driving the sixth mass extinction event in Earth's history. The most important lesson is about the speed of environmental change relative to the capacity of species to adapt. The dinosaurs did not disappear because they were poorly adapted to their environment. They were superbly adapted to the Cretaceous world, the product of hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. They disappeared because the environment changed faster than evolution could respond. No amount of biological sophistication could compensate for a world in which the food supply had collapsed, the temperature had plummeted, and the basic physical conditions of survival had been transformed beyond recognition in the space of years rather than millennia. This is the central truth about mass extinction events. They are not primarily stories about the failure of individual organisms or species. They are stories about the failure of environments to remain stable enough for existing species to persist. When the environment changes slowly, species can adapt. When it changes quickly, adaptation fails and extinction follows. A second lesson concerns the role of body size and ecological flexibility in survival. The creatures that came through the Cretaceous extinction most successfully were, almost universally, small, generalist, and ecologically flexible. They could eat a wide variety of foods. They could tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions. They could reproduce rapidly enough to maintain their populations even under difficult circumstances. The specialists, the large, the slow to reproduce, the dependent on specific ecological relationships, fared much worse. The third lesson is perhaps the most hopeful. Life is extraordinarily resilient. The Cretaceous extinction was the most severe disruption that the terrestrial biosphere had experienced since the Great Dying of the Permian, and it was devastating in its immediate effects. But the planet recovered. The ecosystems rebuilt themselves. The vacant niches were filled by new creatures that, over millions of years, produced a world of biological complexity and diversity that arguably rivals or exceeds what existed before the impact. The world we live in today, with its extraordinary diversity of mammals and birds and fish and flowering plants, is the direct product of the recovery from that catastrophe. It is impossible not to wonder, even as a thought experiment, what the world might look like today if the asteroid had missed. If that 6-mile rock had passed just slightly differently through the gravitational influences of the solar system's planets and swept harmlessly past the Earth 66 million years ago, what would the Cretaceous to Paleogene transition have looked like? The honest answer is that we do not know and cannot know. Evolution is profoundly sensitive to contingency. The particular sequence of events that produced any given species is non-repeatable, but we can make some general observations. The mammals that gave rise to human beings were, in the late Cretaceous, small and ecologically marginal creatures. Without the removal of the dinosaurs, without the sudden opening of the enormous ecological space that their extinction created, there is little reason to think that mammals would have diversified rapidly into large-bodied, ecologically dominant forms. The selective pressures that drove primate brain size upward, that drove the development of the complex social structures, and eventually the language and technology that characterize human civilization, were products of the post-extinction world. In a world where the dinosaurs survived, it seems likely that the mammals would have remained small and nocturnal, as they had been throughout the Mesozoic. The ecological architecture of a dinosaur-dominated world would have left very little space for a creature like us. There might have been, over millions of years, some incremental increase in mammalian diversity and size, but the explosive adaptive radiation that actually occurred, the radiation that produced elephants and whales and horses and apes, would almost certainly not have happened. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the story. The catastrophe that ended one extraordinary chapter in the history of life was also the necessary precondition for the chapter that followed, including the chapter that produced conscious, questioning beings capable of wondering about their own origins and the fate of the magnificent creatures that preceded them. The death of the dinosaurs was, in the longest possible view, the birth of everything that came after. Before we go further, it is important to acknowledge a debate that continues to animate the scientific community, one that adds a layer of complexity to our understanding of the extinction event. Not everyone is entirely satisfied with a single-cause explanation, and the geological evidence demands that we take seriously the role of a second potential catastrophe that was unfolding at almost exactly the same time as the asteroid impact. On the other side of the world, from the Yucatan Peninsula, on the landmass that would eventually become the Indian subcontinent, one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's history was reaching its climax. The Deccan Traps, a massive igneous province covering an area of hundreds of thousands of square miles, were the product of a mantle plume, an upwelling of extraordinarily hot material from deep within the Earth that had been forcing its way through the crust and erupting at the surface in floods of basaltic lava on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. The Deccan eruptions had been occurring for hundreds of thousands of years before the impact, and they continued for hundreds of thousands of years afterward. At their peak, they were releasing enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, enough to drive significant warming in the long term and acidification of rainfall in the shorter term. Some scientists have argued that the Deccan volcanism, even without any asteroid impact, would eventually have stressed the Cretaceous ecosystems to the breaking point, producing a major extinction event, perhaps not as catastrophic as what actually occurred, but severe nonetheless. The asteroid impact appears to have actually altered the character of the Deccan eruptions. Seismic evidence preserved in the rock record suggests that the shock waves from the Chicxulub impact, traveling through the Earth's interior, triggered a significant increase in volcanic activity at the Deccan site within hours or days of the impact. The two catastrophes were not independent. They were, in a very real geological sense, coupled. The asteroid may have effectively supercharged the volcanic eruptions that were already underway, adding their environmental contributions to the already devastating consequences of the impact itself. This interaction between the asteroid and the volcanoes helps explain some features of the extinction record that have puzzled paleontologists. The pattern of species loss was not uniform around the globe. Some regions appear to have experienced more gradual decline before the impact, possibly reflecting the cumulative stress of the Deccan volcanism. Other regions show a much more abrupt transition at the boundary, reflecting the more direct effects of the impact and its immediate consequences. The actual extinction event was probably a complex interaction of multiple stressors, applied over different timescales and with different intensities in different parts of the world, rather than a single simple catastrophic moment. What this complexity tells us is something important about how mass extinctions actually work. They are rarely, if ever, the product of a single cause operating in isolation. They are instead the result of multiple stressors pushing ecosystems beyond their capacity to recover, a cascade of compounding problems, each of which might have been survivable on its own, but which together exceed the resilience of even the most robust and diverse biological communities. The end Cretaceous extinction was the most dramatic example in the last several hundred million years of this principle at work. Much of the discussion about the Cretaceous extinction focuses on the large, charismatic creatures that were lost, and understandably so. The dinosaurs, the pterosaurs, the mosasaurs, the ammonites, these are the losses that capture the imagination. But a complete account of the extinction must also acknowledge the extraordinary diversity of creatures that came through it, some of them in ways that challenge our intuitions about what should and should not survive a planetary catastrophe of this magnitude. The turtles are perhaps the most striking example. Turtles are not, by any obvious measure, well equipped for survival in a world where the sun has been blocked. The food supply has collapsed, and temperatures have plummeted. They are ectothermic, dependent on external heat sources for their metabolism. They have relatively low reproductive rates. They are not obviously flexible or generalist in their diet. And yet turtles came through the Cretaceous extinction with their major lineages intact, and turtles are alive today, having survived more or less unchanged in their basic body plan for over 200 million years. The secret of their survival appears to lie in a combination of traits that are not immediately obvious as survival advantages. Turtles can tolerate extraordinarily long periods without food, their metabolic rate dropping to near zero in cold conditions, rather than continuing to consume energy that is not available. Many turtle species can absorb oxygen through their skin and the linings of their mouths and throats, allowing them to survive underwater through long winters without needing to breathe air. And turtle eggs, buried in the soil, can survive conditions that would be lethal to adult animals. The crocodilians, the group that includes modern crocodiles, alligators, and gharials, are another remarkable story of survival. The late Cretaceous had been a golden age for crocodilian diversity, with species ranging from small, terrestrial, fast-running forms to enormous, fully aquatic, ocean-going giants. Many of these lineages were lost in the extinction, but the basic crocodilian body plan, the ambush predator lying in wait at the water's edge, proved resilient in a way that the active, pursuit-hunting large dinosaurs did not. Crocodilians could go months without eating, lying dormant when prey was unavailable, their metabolism reducing to a minimum. When conditions improved, they could rapidly resume normal activity. This physiological flexibility, combined with their position at the water's edge, where food sources persisted somewhat longer than in purely terrestrial environments, allowed them to survive the worst years. The amphibians, the frogs and salamanders and caecilians are among the oldest groups of land vertebrates, and they too came through the Cretaceous extinction in a state that allowed subsequent diversification. Today, there are more than 8,000 known species of amphibian, representing a lineage that has been on land for over 350 million years. Their survival of the Cretaceous extinction was facilitated by their intimate association with freshwater environments, which, while severely stressed, were somewhat buffered against the worst of the atmospheric and temperature disruptions by the thermal mass of water itself. The insects deserve special mention. As a group, the insects were not severely affected by the Cretaceous extinction in the way that vertebrates were. Many insect lineages came through the boundary intact, and the post-extinction world, with its recovering plant communities and the enormous amounts of dead organic matter available for decomposition, presented insects with extraordinary opportunities. The diversification of flowering plants in the Cenozoic era was matched step by step by a corresponding diversification of the insect pollinators and herbivores that co-evolved with them. The world of insects today, with its staggering diversity of beetles, flies, bees, wasps, butterflies, and countless other orders, is in large part a product of the post-extinction co-evolution of insects and flowering plants. The science of understanding what happened to the dinosaurs and why has been transformed almost beyond recognition in the past few decades. The paleontology of the early 20th century, remarkable as its achievements were, was primarily a science of description, of naming and classifying species based on their bones. The paleontology of the 21st century is something far more ambitious, using techniques borrowed from chemistry, physics, genetics, and computer science to extract information from fossils that earlier scientists could never have imagined obtaining. Isotopic analysis of fossil bones can now reveal information about the temperatures that existed during an animal's lifetime, about what it ate, about how fast it grew, and sometimes about the climate of the region where it lived. Chemical analysis of the thin clay layer at the Cretaceous boundary has provided detailed information about the environmental conditions in the years immediately following the impact. Computer modeling allows scientists to simulate the atmospheric effects of the impact with increasing precision, testing different scenarios against the physical evidence preserved in the rock record. Perhaps most exciting is the emerging science of ancient proteins. While DNA degrades too quickly to survive 66 million years except under the most exceptional conditions, certain proteins are considerably more durable, and scientists have begun recovering and analyzing protein sequences from some dinosaur fossils. These protein sequences can tell us about the biological relationships between dinosaurs and their living relatives, including birds and crocodilians, in ways that the bones alone cannot. The molecular connection between the non-avian dinosaurs and their avian descendants is becoming increasingly clear and detailed as this science advances. The study of growth patterns preserved in fossil bone cross-sections has completely changed our understanding of how dinosaurs lived. By analyzing the microscopic rings in fossil bone, analogous to the growth rings in a tree, scientists have been able to determine how quickly different dinosaur species grew, how long they lived, and at what age they reached sexual maturity. The results have been surprising in many ways, confirming that many dinosaurs grew at rates comparable to modern warm-blooded animals, rather than the slow growth rates of modern reptiles. This, combined with evidence for feathers, complex behavior, and parental care, has produced a picture of the non-avian dinosaurs as dynamic, active, physiologically sophisticated animals, very different from the slow, cold-blooded reptiles of early popular imagination. Understanding what the dinosaurs actually were, rather than what we imagine them to be, makes their extinction both more and less comprehensible. More comprehensible because we can see how creatures of such physiological sophistication and ecological complexity could have filled every available niche so thoroughly. Less comprehensible, perhaps, because it becomes even harder to understand how such successful, well-adapted creatures could be lost so completely and so quickly. The answer, of course, is that no amount of biological sophistication can compensate for an asteroid and the 65 years of darkness that followed. Human beings have been fascinated by dinosaurs since the first fossils were identified as belonging to giant extinct reptiles in the 19th century. There is something about these creatures that captures the imagination in a way that other extinct organisms rarely do. Perhaps it is their scale, the sheer physical enormity of the largest species, that challenges the mind's ability to form a concrete image. Perhaps it is the drama of their disappearance, the violent end to a long and successful story. Or perhaps it is something more fundamental, an instinct embedded deep in the memory of our lineage, a recognition that these creatures were once the context within which our own ancestors lived and struggled and survived. The small mammals of the late Cretaceous, the creatures from which we are descended, spent millions of years living in a world that the dinosaurs owned. They were prey. They were marginal. They were the creatures that scurried under the feet of giants and hoped not to be noticed. And when those giants disappeared, when the world was suddenly emptied of them and refilled with possibility, the ancestors of the primates, and ultimately of human beings, stepped cautiously into the open for the first time. We carry that history in our biology and perhaps in something deeper than biology. The outsized reaction that human beings have always had to reptiles, particularly to large ones, might be the faintest echo of 66 million years of mammalian memory in which large reptiles meant death. The dream of dinosaurs that seems almost universal across human cultures, the recurring appearance of giant, fearsome lizards in the mythologies of peoples who had no access to fossils, might be the most distant reflection of something our lineage actually experienced. And today, we do something that no previous generation of humans could do. We dig up the bones of these creatures and reconstruct their lives with ever-increasing precision and detail. We learn their anatomy and their behavior and their evolutionary relationships. We hold in our hands the teeth and bones of creatures that lived and died 66 million years ago, and we ask the same questions that human beings have always asked. What were they like? How did they live? What did the world look like when they were in it? And what can their story tell us about our own? The answers are still coming. Every new fossil, every new analysis, every new technique for extracting information from ancient bone and ancient sediment adds to our understanding. The story of the dinosaurs is not finished, even though the dinosaurs themselves are long gone. In a very real sense, the story of the dinosaurs is still being written, and we are the ones writing it. There is a final thought worth holding as we consider the full sweep of this story. When we say that the dinosaurs are gone, we are speaking loosely. We have already noted that the birds are dinosaurs, and 10,000 species of living bird is not an insignificant inheritance. But there is something more to be said about continuity and change, and the remarkable persistence of life through catastrophe. Every mass extinction event in Earth's history, and there have been at least 5 that deserve the description of major, has been followed by recovery and diversification. The great dying of the Permian, which came remarkably close to extinguishing all complex life on Earth, was followed by the diversification of the Triassic, which set the stage for the dinosaurs themselves. The extinction at the end of the Triassic, which cleared the way for the dinosaur radiation of the Jurassic, was followed by the most spectacular flourishing of large terrestrial animals the planet had ever seen. And the extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, devastating as it was followed by the Cenozoic, our era, the era of mammals and birds and flowering plants, and eventually of thinking, wondering creatures capable of reconstructing 66 million years of history from the evidence left in stone. Life does not simply survive catastrophe. It seems, against all expectation, to thrive in the aftermath. The space created by mass extinction, the ecological vacuum left behind when dominant forms disappear, is an invitation, a challenge, a question posed by the empty landscape to whatever remains. And evolution, patient and relentless, always answers. The dinosaurs answered that question when the Permian extinction cleared the way for their rise. The mammals answered it when the Cretaceous extinction cleared the way for ours. And somewhere in the deep future, should another catastrophe of similar magnitude visit this planet, something will answer it again. This is perhaps the deepest lesson written in the rocks of the Cretaceous boundary. Not despair at the fragility of life, but wonder at its persistence. Not grief for what was lost, but amazement at what came next. The dinosaurs ruled the Earth for 160 million years. They filled it with their presence in a way that no creature since has matched. And then, 66 million years ago, on a geological morning that began like any other, a light appeared in the sky over what is now Mexico, and the world changed forever. They are gone. They have been gone for 66 million years. And yet the sky above you is full of their descendants, the birds that carry within their bones and feathers and behaviors the unmistakable signature of everything that came before. Look up the next time a bird takes flight from a branch, the next time a hawk circles on a thermal updraft, or a crow eyes you with what seems like unsettling intelligence. You are looking at a dinosaur, the last ones, the survivors, the bridge between the world that was and the world that is. The story never truly ends.